In her biography of Robert Burns, Catherine Carswell tells us that after he arrived in Edinburgh, and knowing that Fergusson was buried in the Canongate kirkyard, Robert went there that he might kiss the earth where the adorable poet lay. But it was a sleeveless errand. He could not find the grave. It was unmarked and unknown. In his letter to the Baileys of the Canongate, he despairs at Fergusson's neglect and announces his desire to pay for some memorial to direct the steps of the lovers of Scottish song when they wish to shed a tear over the narrow house of the bard who is now no more. Burns then had the prospect of an income from his upcoming second edition of his poems, but the cost was still extravagant. And, as Carol McGurk points out, at the time of this venture, Burns' own brother, who had died 2 years earlier, was lying in an unmarked grave in Morclin. But it wasn't to be John Burns, but Robert's spiritual elder brother in the Muse, Robert Fergusson, that he commissioned a headstone for, a decision that would leave him with what Rona Brown calls substantial and enduring arrears. So in order to honour Fergusson and mark their kinship, Burns paid for the stone and wrote the verse to be engraved upon it. But as we'll see on today's episode, the 4 lines you can read on the grave in Canongate kirkyard don't quite tell the full story. Hello and welcome to Earread This, Edinburgh's most powerful book podcast. I'm Ash, your host, and today I'll be talking about Robert Burns' Epitaph for Robert Fergusson, which first appeared in print and on stone in 1789. And since the poem is on the short side, and to make up for this much delayed Burns Night episode, I'll also talk about 2 other short poems that Burns wrote in tribute to Fergusson. And if you'd like to hear more about Fergusson himself, you can listen to my previous podcast, which is all about his poem The Daft Days, and I hope to return to Fergusson in the not-too-distant future. As usual, when it comes to the poem, I'll go through line by line, stopping to share some ideas and refer to critics of Burns. To start things off, though, I thought I'd set the scene by describing how the gravestone came about. So first of all, Fergusson had died in 1774 in pretty lamentable circumstances, having had some kind of mental health crisis compounded by a head injury. In 1782, Burns was making an arduous living heckling flax in Irvine, having more or less given up on poetry. It was then through a bookseller named Templeton that he acquired a copy of Fergusson's poems. Catherine Carswell comments, "Perhaps Robert bought it, perhaps Templeton gave it in return for the amusement of hearing his young friend declaiming aloud from the latest batch of ballad strips, which is why, where I work in John Kay's bookshop, we have a very strict no declaiming policy. If you want a book, you're going to have to pay for it. We've been burnt before." Burns' report of the effect of reading Fergusson is famous. "Rhyme I had given up," he wrote to John Moore 5 years later in 1787. "But meeting with Fergusson's Scottish poems, I struck anew my wildly sounding lyre with emulating vigour." That was the year he was in Edinburgh and keen to visit Fergusson's burial place. Dismayed to find no memorial to the poet only recently thought of as Edinburgh's laureate, he began to wonder what could be done to rectify the situation. John Campbell, then Canongate precentor, was an acquaintance of Burns and advised him on who to write to about the state of Fergusson's remains. So Burns wrote his letter, bemoaning the bones of Fergusson that do honour to our Caledonian name, lie in your churchyard among the ignoble dead, unnoticed and unknown. Here, and not for the only time, the history of Fergusson's grave acquires a note of farce, as Burns sent the letter to the wrong people. According to Catherine Carswell, upon receiving a reply from the Baileys telling him to direct his message to the kirkyard managers, Burns blasphemed. But eventually the letter found its way into the right hands, and the kirkyard managers approved the erection of a stone for Fergusson on the 22nd of February, 1787. But approval was only part of the battle. Burns would still have to cover all of the costs. Strangely, the name of the architect hired to build the stone was Robert Burn. Burn also designed the Hermitage of Braid and the Nelson Monument on Colton Hill, which is visible from Fergusson's gravestone. Burns was a long time in settling the bill for Fergusson's stone. The full £5 and 10 shillings was finally paid off in February 1792. But as Burns recounted in a letter to Peter Hill, "Mr. Burn, the architect, was 2 years in erecting the stone, and I have been 2 years in paying him. So he and I are quits." He added that the architect had asked for interest, but since he was dealing with a poet, he was lucky to even get a farthing. Before we get to the poem itself, let's look at the reverse of the stone, which has this inscription: "By special grant of the managers to Robert Burns, who erected this stone, this burial place is to remain forever sacred to the memory of Robert Fergusson." Then round on the front, we have this first stanza. "No sculptured marble here, nor pompous lay, nor storied urn, nor animated bust. This simple stone directs pale Scotia's way to pour her sorrow o'er the poet's dust." It proceeds crisply and grandly along those hand clasps of alliterating S's and P's. Burns expresses his sorrow at the paucity of Fergusson's memorial, which in the kirkyard, if not in print, comes off as slightly overblown modesty, coming from what is in fact a rather large and handsome stone. But no stone could be equal to his memory, Burns implies. Fergusson should be remembered in marble, or a storied urn like the Grecian urns depicting classical scenes of battle, or an animated bust, which in Fergusson's case might have been a tall order due to the uncertain accuracy and whereabouts of his likeness. In the end, all Fergusson has is this simple stone, which Burns imagines being visited by pale Scotia, the embodiment of the country heartbroken, white-faced with grief, and come to pay her respects. The stanza form of Burns's epitaph is based on that of Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. Burns quotes this poem in his second line. Gray's version reads, "Can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion call the fleeting breath?" Gray revised his famous poem over a number of years, and the final version concluded with an epitaph of its own for a poet who died before his time. "Here rests his head upon the lap of earth, a youth to fortune and to fame unknown." The poem's narrator, in considering the fate of this unknown poet, almost inevitably speculates on his own mortality too, something we will see Burns do with his epitaphs and his later poems on Fergusson. The death of Fergusson becomes eventually a cipher for his own. So despite Burns emphasising Fergusson as Scotland's national poet and having pale Scotia herself come to pour her sorrow o'er the poet's dust, Burns does so not only in English, not Scots, but in direct reference to an English poem. To look at the stone in Canongate Kirkyard, you would see it has plenty of space available beneath this stanza, and you might wonder why the next two stanzas we're going to look at aren't also there. According to the Canongate Burns, stanzas 2 and 3 were written in Burns's second commonplace book, and since this book wasn't recovered until the 1870s, the following stanzas did not enter the canon until then. As well as appearing on the gravestone, the first stanza that we've just looked at was also printed in the Edinburgh Advertiser in August 1789. Moving on to the second stanza then. "She mourns, sweet tuneful youth, thy hapless fate. Though all the powers of song thy fancy fired, yet luxury and wealth lay by in state, and thankless starved what they so much admired." So more outrage at Fergusson's hapless fate, and an impossible to ignore now omen or foretaste of Burns's own destiny, dying beset with financial worries that would seem trifling in the light of the phenomenal success of his works after his death. Although Burns achieved fame in his own time and enjoyed some of its rewards, it was nothing compared to the industry that grew up around his works and legend after he died. For him, as well as for Fergusson, luxury and wealth were lying in state and arriving too late to clear his debts. Ironically, the very circumstances of writing this poem enfold a rash financial decision on Burns's part, spending beyond his means in expectation of better times to come. It's a curious image, isn't it, that luxury and wealth lay by in state, so the riches that Fergusson had rightly won himself were there, but refusing to ripen in time, like stubborn, unyielding roots, starving the artist they so much admired. So what sounds like lethargy in the third line becomes cruelty in the fourth. Luxury and wealth lying by in state as if they are also deceased, visible to mourners in the kirkyard, finally awakening in the small harvest of this stone, but too little and too late to be of any use to Fergusson. Let's move on to the third and final stanza of Burns's epitaph. "This humble tribute with a tear he gives, a brother bard he can no more bestow, But dear to fame thy song immortal lives, a nobler monument than art can show. Burns here brings to mind another English poet and another brother bard, Shakespeare, who also wrote of art and song outlasting memorials of stone. In Sonnet 55, Shakespeare wrote, "Nor marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme." And in Sonnet 18, "But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderst in his shade, when in eternal rhymes to time thou growst." That Burns's last line makes a reference to monument makes it seem as if these stanzas were indeed meant to be engraved. I'm not sure why they weren't, to be honest. Perhaps Robert Burns charged by the couplet. However, as I said, there is space on the stone to add the others, which offers up the invitation for someone with £5 on them to perhaps write another letter to the kirkyard managers. In this final stanza, Burns makes his feeling of brotherhood with Fergusson explicit. The two share obvious similarities despite their quite different upbringings. Both wrote in Scots, both celebrated conviviality and the comical side of life, both used many of the same poetic forms, from the Habby stanzas we've looked at more than once on the podcast, to elegies, satires, dialogues, and epistles. They shared influences not only in other Scots poets like Alan Ramsay, but English poets of the neoclassical period as well. As David Dakies has written, Burns was the heir of Robert Fergusson in his reconstructing of a Scottish poetic idiom out of a mixture of colloquial and literary language. And although Fergusson's poems brim with scenes of light-heartedness, Carol McGurk has written that of the two, Burns has the more hopeful temperament, saying, "Burns is simply not as afraid of the dark as Fergusson. Fergusson's Scotland is a darker place. He is less hopeful and more haunted than Burns." This might seem surprising, not only in light of Fergusson's high spirits, but equally the melancholy and dismal moments that we find in Burns's canon and biography, some of which I think we glimpse in these verses on his elder brother in misfortune. As Robert Crawford has said, Burns was not so much preceded by Fergusson as haunted by him. Commenting on Burns's extensive borrowings from Fergusson, H.J.C. Grierson has written, "Fergusson was to Burns all, or more than all, that Marlowe was to Shakespeare in tragedy, Lilly in comedy. Fergusson's was possibly the more inventive mind." Burns certainly seems to say as much with his deferential Epitaph. And while he may have been able to see the similarities between himself and Fergusson, and to imagine that the younger brother might share the elder brother's fate, what he can't possibly have predicted is how his anxiety of influence would rebound on the reputation of Fergusson, that the man who came to stand a stone up in Fergusson's memory would also come to overshadow him. By marking his hero's grave with his own words, Burns only strengthened the connection between them, a connection that to some degree encourages the very neglect Burns is decrying. Fergusson scholars and fans have rightly protested that Fergusson should be read on his own terms, as an original and peculiar poet who deserves better than to be housed in narrow, categorical readings. Sally Mapston, for example, writing in the London Review of Books, has said, "It would be a pity if Fergusson's poems were to be read merely for signs of incipient madness, nationalism, or Burnsism." But oblivious of what fortune had in store for them both, Burns encouraged the connection, as we can see in this second poem, which was written beneath a frontispiece portrait in a copy of Fergusson's poems. The book was presented to a young aspiring poet called Rebecca Carmichael and dated March the 19th, 1787, so just less than a month after the gravestone had been approved. Untitled in the transcription, Burns' editor William Scott Douglas calls this poem Lines Under the Portrait of Fergusson, and you'll sometimes find it, depending on what collection you have, grouped together with the other two poems in today's episode, or called some variation of On Robert Fergusson or Lines on the Poet Robert Fergusson. This confusing editorial history is in some way explained by the fact that these poems came out in different times and in different bits and pieces. So as we've already said, the second two stanzas weren't uncovered until the late 19th century, whereas the two stanzas we're going to look at now were first published in a collection in 1808, published by Robert Cromek, called Relics of Robert Burns. So here's the first stanza of this second poem, or I say stanza, it's a couplet. Curse on ungrateful man that can be pleased and yet can starve the author of the pleasure. More ingratitude, starving, returns again, and this time there's a real vengeful air. We've gone from a tribute to a curse. Rona Brown comments that in this short tribute, the poet becomes author not simply of diverting literature, but of pleasure itself. So as the sentiment has ramped up and become more aggressive, the status of Fergusson has also been amplified. Now we come to the famous lines found in the second stanza of this poem. O thou, my elder brother in misfortune, by far my elder brother in the Muse, with tears I pity thy unhappy fate. Why is the bard unfitted for the world, yet has so keen a relish of its pleasures? So he's underlining their brotherhood once again. Fergusson is his elder, who has gone further in misfortune and further in the Muse. If Burns is in earnest in calling Fergusson the greater poet, it should be said that not everyone agreed with him. Walter Scott said that Burns had 20 times the abilities of Fergusson, as well as that even older brother in the Muse, Alan Ramsay. In Scott's opinion, Burns talked of these two with far too much humility. And here too, Burns elaborates on his idea of the bard's special doom, to have their relish of the world matched by their ill-suitedness for it. An unromantic response to this might be to point out that having so keen a relish of the world's pleasures is exactly what ends up making you unfit to be seen in it. But I think what Burns is evoking is the trope of genius and tragedy being ineffably linked, that those who burn the brightest never fade away, and so forth. A trope that would be again employed in reflections and accounts of his own demise a decade later. Carol McGurk writes that the Kilmarnock edition had been received with a wild enthusiasm that Fergusson's own poetry had never enjoyed, and some emotion more complex than appreciation, something conscience-stricken, underlines the episode of Burns and Fergusson's grave. And there is, in his performative grief, his cursing, his tears, something apologetic about Burns's writing. This is, after all, a bard building a grave with the spoils he received, in part, for robbing that same grave. With McGurk's astute reading in mind, there is a resonance in a letter Burns writes to Peter Stewart of someone soothing their own conscience. Poor Fergusson, writes Burns, if there be a life beyond the grave, thou art now enjoying existence in a glorious world, where riches, derived of all their pleasure-purchasing powers, return to their native sordid matter, where titles and honours are the disregarded reveries of an idle dream, and where that heavy virtue, which is the negative consequence of steady dullness, and those thoughtless, though often destructive follies, which are the unavoidable aberrations of frail human nature, will be thrown into equal oblivion as if they had never been. Here Burns places the responsibility for the fate of Fergusson into the hands of the cosmos, where he vehemently and colourfully hopes he is being adequately compensated. Finally, we come to the third little poem on Fergusson. William Scott Douglas calls this 8-line poem Lines on the Poet Fergusson, and says it was composed in 1792, and again inscribed in a copy of a book. According to the Canongate Burns, it was first published in the Scots magazine, November 1803. Ill-fated genius, heaven-taught Fergusson, what heart that feels and will not yield a tear, to think life's sun did set ere well begun, to shed its influence on thy bright career. So one further spin on the bard myth, and particularly striking here is the phrase heaven-taught. Burns himself was famously described as the heaven-taught ploughman, a moniker he had ambivalent feelings about. Fergusson, who was high school and university educated, is even less suited to being called heaven-taught than Burns. As Gerard Carruthers has written, Fergusson represented a literary tradition as sophisticated as anything in 18th century England. Neither Burns nor Fergusson was heaven-taught, but Burns is willing to play along, even as his transference onto Fergusson of the idiom applied to Burns, of appearing out of nowhere, points up the fact that to some extent Burns had come out of Fergusson. I like the circularity of this. Burns, in an anguish of guilt and kinship, enjoying the success Fergusson never had, and partially in thanks to his borrowings of Fergusson, overcompensates by placing on Fergusson the crown he has unwillingly been given. But the gift not only underlines Burns's debt, but suiting neither of them thickens the shadow of one over the other. Despite Burns describing Robert Fergusson as the author of pleasure, these poems have become more and more distraught with an endless procession of weepers. The poet weeping, anyone with a heart weeping, and then pale Scotia herself, Scotland herself, weeping. As Rona Brown says, Robert Burns contributed to the tear-stained legend of Fergusson's tragedy by casting him as the heartbreakingly neglected and isolated literary genius. It should be said that Burns ignores other readers and admirers of his hero. Although his fame far eclipsed that of Fergusson's, his predecessor was not as neglected as he suggests. When Fergusson was ill, he was popular enough for his condition to be a public cause of concern in Edinburgh. And, as Brown notes, members of the Cape Club gathered a generous collection of money for his benefit, and readers of the weekly magazine sent anxious letters asking for news of their house poet. Moving on to the second stanza of this third poem. Oh, why should truest worth and genius pine beneath the iron grasp of want and woe, while titled knaves and idiot greatness shine in all the splendour fortune can bestow? A reminder here of Burns's comment in his letter to the Baileys about the ignoble dead, where he seemed to be appalled at Fergusson being kept amongst the hoi polloi. Here he resents the preferential treatment given to the titled and undeserving, shining with idiot greatness. And although that brings us to the end of the poems, before we go, I just want to briefly describe the afterlife of Fergusson's gravestone. By 1850, long after Burns's own passing, the stone was in need of repairs, which were paid for by another poet and another Robert Gilfillan. Not long after that, Robert Louis Stevenson, who referred to himself, Fergusson and Burns as "we three Robins," also planned to repair the stone, unaware that renovations were possibly no longer required. He was, in all fairness, planning this renovation from the South Seas, writing worriedly to Charles Baxter about the optics of leaving his own inscription and the placement of the three Roberts. Stevenson died before anything could be done, but a plaque was added to the gravestone recording his intention. And to throw a almost unbelievable fifth Robert into the mix, the Edinburgh-born poet Robert Garrick, or Geary, composed a poem called At Fergusson's Grave, in which he notes, "Here Robert Burns knelt and kissed the mool." Finally, just outside the Canongate kirkyard, a sculpture of Fergusson was erected in 2004, created by David Annand. In one last twist that harks back to Burns despairing at the lack of appreciation for Fergusson, a year after the sculpture was unveiled, the friends of Robert Fergusson had to pay for the addition of paving stones which explained who he was to passers-by, instead of, in the words of one representative, standing there like a foundling with no name. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this very belated Burns Night episode. I do have other podcasts in the works, so if you want to hear more, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, whether it's on YouTube or your audio platform. As I say, I'd quite like to return to Fergusson sometime this year, but there's plenty of other writers to cover in the meantime from Scotland and abroad. So if that sounds good, tune in next time, and until then, happy reading.